And I think our first reading this morning comes to us from Jamie Stroud.
Yes, Jamie is bringing our first reading this morning. And some of you know Jamie, some of you don't. And some of you have received beautiful uh, cards from our church. I want to let you know that this is the woman behind those cards. So some of you have already received her beautiful words. Jamie is many things. And one of the things that she does is write poems, and she will be bringing us our first reading this morning. Go ahead, Jamie.
Yep. This, am I not muted? I'm good.
You're good.
Okay.
You're good. Go for it.
Thank you. Um, this poem that I'm going to read today is, I realized as I did some research on it in my files, I started working on in 2012. And that was a time when I was feeling depressed, disconnected from God, trying to find ways to reconnect. And I realized I didn't finish it to this form anyhow until October of 2018. So it's was a work in progress for a number of years, but I think it's at its finish point right now. So it's titled My Soul. You are so much like newly sprouted grass. You grow healthy, green, and tall when lovingly tended. You grow rampantly in almost any type of soil if you are well nourished. You wither, become dingy, unhealthy, and unattractive without adequate nourishment, but you can be rejuvenated with air, water, and sun. If you get cut back or mowed down, you seem diminished and near death for a while, but you grow back stronger than before. If you're flooded, oversaturated, and overwhelmed, you become lifeless, but you're flooded, but let me start that one over again. If you're flooded, oversaturated, and overwhelmed, you become lifeless, but with steady, patient drainage, you again become rich and copious. If the winds blow you down to the earth, you snap right back upright again, reaching for the sky when the winds die down. If you're covered by fall leaves, you give up and turn brown, or you push your way upward and reach toward the sun's warmth. When the winter snows, ice, when the winter snows, ice, and grayness come, you become buried under preserving cover and sprout anew in the spring. You need light, and you lean to follow the brightness of the sun. Oh, my soul, when you're constantly tended and cared for, well nourished and gently encouraged, you flourish. You put down deep, strong roots in your God. Like the grass during the rough spells when there seems to be no rain, no sun, no air. In times of flooding or when God seems missing, God patiently encourages you to draw strength and courage from your resilient roots, roots that enable you to grow, remain robust and vigorous, stretch for the sun, and once again, to God.
Oh, Jamie, I invite you to look around the room and see all the love you're getting, all the appreciation, all the care and gratitude. Thank you for all the ways that you share your words, your heart, your life, and your love with us in this church. Thank you so much. What a beautiful poem. Our other sacred text this morning comes from 1 John, the 4th chapter, verses 7 to 8. Beloved, let us love one another, because love is of God. Everyone who loves is born of God and knows God. Whoever does not love does not know God, for God is love. I've never been afraid to be out in public. That's in large part, or at least not usually afraid to be out in public. That's in large part because of the body that I have and the skin that I'm in. And I'm also pretty social, and increasingly introverted extrovert, but an extrovert nonetheless. I was never afraid to go into stores, walk down streets, move about places that I've never been. My white-skinned privilege and my personality have made me pretty bold, or at least I used to be. Throughout the pandemic, I was, in our 7-person household, the hunter-gatherer. I was the one to get groceries, to take my parents to the doctor when it couldn't be postponed, to get supplies, to go to the post office, to navigate public space. Early on in the pandemic, when I was at the Acme, trying to follow the arrows that they had put on the floor designed to send people one way down narrow aisles to minimize contact, I found myself unbelievably stressed. People weren't going the right ways. Their masks were slipping and they were scratching their exposed noses, and then they'd pick up cans and jars and change their minds and put them back on the shelves. People would ride up on me, reaching across where I stood in that "don't mind me, I'll just be a sec" kind of way, invading my space and breathing my air. The Acme changed their layout, and I no longer knew where things were, and I found myself needing to double or triple back, having to pass more people and navigate more arrows and more breath, and try to search for the dang lentils, which were supposed to be in aisle 3 near the tuna, but which now were in ethnic foods, whatever that's supposed to mean. I would come home physically, mentally, and psychically drained, and acutely aware of how my usual levels of goodwill for my fellow humans had drained away as well. One day, very, very early on, in the middle of the bread aisle, and I still remember it, it dawned on me. I wonder if this is something of what it feels to be disabled or autistic. I wonder if these incredibly high levels of stress and anxiety that I'm feeling and that I have about my exposure to and contact with other people, the frustration about not being able to figure out the order or the logic of how the space is laid out, the incredible amount of energy it takes to try to find one more thing or move around people who seem completely unaware of the ways in which they're creating obstacles or putting others at risk, and the deep sense of vulnerability that I was feeling. I wonder if that might be just a fraction of what it's like for so many other people, all the time, every day. In this past year, I'll bet almost all of us have had at least one experience of anxiety or fear or panic about the possibility of personally being at risk because of the presence of another human being. Depending on the skin that we're in and the kinds of brains and bodies that we have, some of us may be just noticing this for the first time. Some of us have felt it on and off over our lives, and some of us have been living with this level of vulnerability and danger most of our lives. Through absolutely no fault of our own, how much we have experienced this and how regularly may depend in part on where we fall on what Sonia Renee Taylor, the author of The Body Is Not an Apology, calls the ladder of bodily hierarchy. This past year, in my mind, has been what I think of as the year of the body. We've struggled to protect our own bodies and the bodies of those we love against an enemy we can't see with the naked eye. I know that I'm not alone in having dreams still, even where I'm in a crowded space with people who aren't masked, and I wake up shaken and afraid. I have feared for those most vulnerable in my life and broken down in despair when I considered the possibility that by making that trip to the post office to try to get the medicines that my parents needed to stay healthy, I may have actually inadvertently carried back a droplet containing the virus that might kill them. I've stood at so many graves over the past years, burying people I will never know, people the world should never have lost. And millions of people around the world, in this country and beyond, have been putting their bodies on the line in the middle of a raging virus to demand justice for bodies broken by state-sanctioned violence and emboldened anti-Black and anti-trans violence. George Floyd, Breonna Taylor, Tony McDade, Ahmaud Arbery, Walter Walls Jr., Remy Fells, and so many more. Some of you in this congregation were in the front lines when police charged and tear gassed protesters in June, driving them scrambling up embankments and over fences. Many of you, in fact, about a quarter of our congregation, turned out once or sometimes over and over and over again at the height of the raging virus to demand justice, change, accountability in a country so deeply ravaged by the white supremacy that's a very part of the foundation of our nation. We've experienced, so many of us, the vulnerability of our own bodies and the bodies of those we love, as well as people we would never have otherwise known, but whose last breaths and beautiful faces have been seared onto our hearts. Beloved, let us love one another. Man, sometimes that has been hard. The text goes on to emphasize this, adding a little twist. Beloved, since God loved us so much, we also ought to love one another. We love because God loves us. And I want to expand this a little bit because you know I sometimes play a little fast and loose with the Bible. After all, our national UCC denomination says God is still speaking. Beloved, since God loves us so much, we also ought to love ourselves. And I mean that in a radical way. Radical self-love is about more than flimsy notions of self-confidence or self-esteem. It goes beyond individualism. It's not independent, it's about interdependence. And it's not only about our relationship with our bodies, but the relationship that we have with the bodies of others. But it starts with ourselves and our bodies. Christianity has a dicey relationship with bodies. Some of the people who brought us the most revolutionary ways of thinking about God also happen to bring us some absolutely awful ideas about what it means to be a body. Looking at you, Augustine. We are the inheritors of terrible ideas about bodies as wicked, as temptation, as weak. Add to that the body terrorism of white skin supremacy, colorism, fat phobia, transphobia, homophobia, ableism, sexism, violence against Muslims, immigrants, and people of other religions and cultures. Sonia Renee Taylor in the book writes, living in a female body, a Black body, an aging body, a fat body, a body with mental illness is to awaken daily to a planet that expects a certain set of apologies to already live on our tongues. There is a level of not enough or too much sewn into these strands of difference. What messages have you gotten about being in a body like yours in this world? What messages have you gotten about maybe not being enough or being too much or not worthy, not good enough? I invite you to think about what those might be, and if you want to, you can put them in the chat. There's something important and healing about exercising some of the messages that we were given, exercising in an exorcism, getting them out, putting them out in the light of day and banishing them. If there are messages that you got and you'd like to share them, I invite you to put them in the chat. We've all gotten messages about our bodies, our skin, our hair, how we carry ourselves, the kind of places that we've occupied as we've grown up in this world full of bodily hierarchy. I started dieting when I was in 6th grade, not because I was overweight, not because my parents told me to, but in the Young Miss magazines that I was reading and the other magazines that I was reading in the early 70s, I got the message that good girls were skinny and diets were cool. In other words, I was taught early that depriving myself, denying my body, detaching from it, even starving it, was what I needed to do in order to be a good girl, and by extension, a good woman. Fasting and diet pills and diet foods wrecked my body's ability to communicate what it needed and wrecked my ability to listen. It separated the spiritual me from the bodily me, as if I could be anything other than a physical form. And some of the interpretations of Christianity that I experienced as a young person only reinforced the notion that our bodies are to be controlled and contained and downright dangerous. And they encouraged me to cut myself off from my body even more. But we did not come into the world with this stuff. We came into a world that had messages about this stuff ready to impose on us and teach us and indoctrinate us. And we, in turn, have sent those messages back out into the world. But we didn't come into the world with this stuff. We were all babies once. And if you've ever watched a baby discover their toes or their hands or their new ability to crawl or walk, you know that babies think their bodies are magic. I remember watching our daughter Sonia discover the intense joy that she could get when she was able to manage and navigate for the first time her thumb into her mouth. We were all once those babies. Every single one of us thought our bodies were freaking amazing, which is exactly, if you ask me, what God intended, what God intends for us, not just as babies, but for us now, to recapture, reimagine, and reconnect to that feeling. For us to think that our bodies, with their curves and rolls and pains and scars and hair and wrinkles and wounds, are freaking amazing. And I believe that God intends for us to marvel at other bodies that are different from ours, but also made in God's image and are no less freaking amazing, in the same way that I got to marvel over Sonia experiencing the joy of her thumb. The first time that I sat in our scruffy little sanctuary, it's much less scruffy now, with the pews facing into the center and the burn hole in the blue carpet with the purple flecks. And I saw Melinda Tatum Kaiser, Karen Clementi, and Lisa Lovelace dance. I wept. Here, just a few feet away from me, in the middle of church, were these bodies being unapologetically embodied. These were real bodies, real women, gorgeous women, taking up space as bodies, not on a stage at a distance, but just inches away from us, moving powerfully with all their curves and weight and grace and strength and tenderness in ways that felt like so much God and so rooted and so holy. And over the years, other dancers have danced in that space. Jermaine, you're here this morning, others. And the opening slide that we started worship with this morning had a picture of Melinda and Karen again with Michelle Williams dancing during Advent just a few years ago in that same space. When we dare to embrace our embodiedness and the embodiedness of others, even, no, especially when those other bodies are different, foreign, confusing, the way their bodies work or look, the way their brains work, when they don't make sense to us, when we can still embrace the embodiedness of those other people, something powerful, something spiritual, something political happens when we embrace our own embodiedness and that of others. The great Audre Lorde has said, caring for myself is not self-indulgence, it's not self-preservation. And caring for myself is an act of political warfare. Political warfare, but not in a violent sense, in a revolutionary sense. Because every time we say no more and call truce with our bodies, we interrupt systems of violence that profit off our own self-hate. Every time we interrogate the beliefs and the assumptions that we have about other bodies, even those of people we know, we interrupt a system that's built on a ladder of bodily hierarchy. When we make peace or work to make peace with our bodies and the very notion of difference in bodies, we create an opening for a more just and equitable world. When we interrupt notions that we need to deprive ourselves and deprive others, that we need to control ourselves and control others, then we're building a radical self-love world, free from the systems of oppression that make it difficult and sometimes deadly to live in these bodies. And a radical self-love world can include a radical self-love church. That can look like having a round-the-clock on-call system of people signed up for slots to respond in the event of a threat, which is what we did following the Capitol insurrection, when the National United Church of Christ issued an alert to progressive churches like ours that we could be at risk. A radical self-love church can look like showing up in the streets to call for a new way of being a nation and showing up in church meetings to work for new ways of being beloved community. And a radical self-love church can look like keeping the doors closed and Zoom open until the most vulnerable among us can safely worship in person, even if it means we're about the last to go back into our building. Again, Sonia Renee Taylor writes, it's through our own transformed relationship with our bodies that we become champions for other bodies on the planet. As we awaken to that indoctrinated body shame, we feel inspired to awaken others and interrupt those systems that perpetuate body shame and oppression against all bodies. There is a whisper, she writes, that we keep hearing. It is saying that we must build in us what we want to see built in the world. To quote another wise poet, our own Jamie Stroud spoke in her reading to the soul, and I hope, Jamie, it's okay if I extend this to bodies. Oh, my soul, she writes, oh, my body. When you're constantly tended and cared for, well nourished and gently encouraged, you flourish. You put down deep, strong roots in your God. And when those roots go down deep, we connect to God, to our own power. Those roots, like the roots of the trees who search out and communicate, we know this scientifically, that trees talk to each other underground. When they search out and communicate with other trees, those roots connect to the holiness and sacredness when we do the same, of the dignity and beauty of the other bodies around us. I invite you, as we're closing, to put yourself on gallery view and just look around this room. There may be people you know here. There may be faces that are familiar that you've been seeing across a room for years in a sanctuary. There may be people that you love who are at a distance. There are faces surely that you have never seen before this morning. But look at those that are here and the ones who are behind their name, even if you can't see their faces. Their bodies, like ours, are struggling, striving, resting, playing, longing, healing, surviving, hurting, growing. Y'all, we are surviving. Beloved, you are enough. You are not too much. You do not need to make excuses for the miracle that is your body. Your skin is beautiful. Your body is beautiful. You are not an apology. You are freaking amazing. And so are the bodies all around you. And you are loved. This is God's good news. Amen.